I'm with Accessory Solutions, which is the pharmacy benefit arm of the Lockton Dunning Consulting Group. We're part of Lockton Companies, a worldwide benefit consulting firm. Many of you probably heard me over some various calls we've had with the IQVIA team related to pharmacy benefits or kind of health and welfare more generally. Today, we're going to be walking through a little bit of a COVID-19 vaccine update for IQVIA members. We just want to kind of shed a little bit of light and background in terms of vaccines that are available, as well as some nuances with those. We're going to talk a little bit about variants. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of coverage on the IQVIA plan. And then finally, we have a panel of experts to answer a number of questions that we've kind of prepared, but also give IQVIA members the opportunity to ask some questions you may have around vaccines or COVID-19 broadly. So the idea here is that we're going to kind of set the table in terms of where the vaccine landscape lands right now. And then, as I said, based on that information, if you all have broad questions, kind of more general questions, we're not looking for anything personal necessarily. Want to give folks the opportunity to lob those towards the clinicians that are on the panel a little bit later on. So I think with that, we can get started. So quick agenda here, as I said, we're going to talk about the current vaccines that are out in the marketplace, as well as some that are under development still, talk a little bit about vaccine development for children, touch on the variants really quickly, and then talk a little bit about, as I mentioned, IQVIA's coverage of testing, vaccines, treatment, and then finally we're going to get to some people who are much smarter than I am to talk about COVID vaccines and some background and nuances related to very clinical things, but not in a complex clinical way. We're going to have the panelists kind of answer some questions that we very often have to field from our clients related to COVID vaccines, as well as kind of COVID more generally. So again, want this to be as informal and as educational as possible. And as I said, that COVID panel at the bottom is going to give you folks an opportunity to ask any questions you may have related to any of these topics. All right, so as you can see on the slide here, this is kind of a quick breakdown of what the current vaccines are in the marketplace. So the red box you see at the top, those are the three that are in the marketplace right now. And I'll talk a little bit about each of them in kind of broad detail. At the bottom, you'll see the AstraZeneca vaccine, which I think you've heard some likely news stories about related to Europe, as well as some release of data in terms of efficacy in the United States. But first, I'll focus on the vaccines that are on the marketplace. And so the first one you see on here, or the first two, Pfizer and Moderna. As many of you likely know, these are the two-dose vaccines that use a technology called mRNA, which, again, if Dr. Diaz or somebody would like to explain what the mRNA technology does later on, I'm happy to have them do that. But realistically, there's been occasionally some concern about, well, this is a new technology. By and large, the mRNA technology that's used for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines is not new. It's like 30 years old, which has been used in various other scientific applications. And so these two are the vaccines that require two shots. The Pfizer is indicated for folks that are 16 years of age and older. Moderna is indicated for folks that are 18 years of age and older. And the Pfizer shot requires shots about 3 weeks apart. The Moderna one requires shots that are about 4 weeks apart. But again, these vaccines are very similar in terms of how they work and how they make the body react to essentially a virus. The Johnson & Johnson shot, which is the third one, which you likely heard some information about this week, and we'll have one of the panelists discuss a little bit later. But this Johnson & Johnson shot is more of a traditional vaccine in how it works. It only requires one dose. There is some concerns or some questions around efficacy of this. Obviously, the news that came out this week was related to the blood clots that are a possibility. But again, we'll pause for that part of it and have one of the physicians that are on the phone explain a little bit later what that means. And one overarching thing to mention about these three vaccines is that they're approved under a emergency use authorization, which means not technically FDA approved, but are basically given the head nod from the FDA to say these are safe enough that we believe they should be used broadly, particularly because we are addressing a once in a lifetime crisis effectively, right, in terms of what COVID has done to the country and the economy and all that sort of stuff. So very broadly, as I mentioned, these are the three that are available. The AstraZeneca one, which is not in that red box, is available in Europe. I know that the United States has something in the way of like 10 million vaccines of this saved. The efficacy of this vaccine is very similar to the three that are boxed above. There was some concern about the way that the data was released a couple of weeks ago related to the AstraZeneca vaccine, but realistically, this is more of a concern of how the data was released, not what the data actually said once it came out. And so, this may be approved in the United States upcoming shortly. But again, the three vaccines that we have available, there should be more than enough doses for everybody in the country who wants to get one. So one more bullet point on this that I wanted to point out to everybody is that if you see at the very bottom, we talk about anticipated distribution and availability. At the very bottom there, it says by July, there should be 400 million doses of the three vaccines at the top combined. For those guessing along at home, there's only 350 million people in the United States. And so the availability of these vaccines should be incredibly widespread by midsummer. We're getting there now in terms of what's available. I would say the lion's share of the vaccines in the marketplace are split between Pfizer and Moderna. Obviously, with the Johnson & Johnson being paused, that is going to put a little bit of a dent in it, but realistically, the majority of the shots that are available for folks right now are the first two that are at the very top. So again, we are progressing towards, herd immunity, let's call it, in terms of what's available in the marketplace very quickly. We, as of right now in the middle of April, are probably where folks thought we were going to be in midsummer if you talk to them in mid-February, because these vaccines started being administered in December. And then it was, it could take a year. And then it was, well, maybe it'll be 6 months. And now it's, we're going to have 400 million doses by July. And so I think some of that was hedging in terms of folks not wanting to put too much false hope if it wasn't going to come to fruition. But I think the way that the pharma manufacturers and the way that the vaccine rollout has gone over the last 2 months in particular has really gotten us to the point where we have progressed much, much quicker in the vaccine administration space than we maybe thought we were going to a couple of months ago. So I would say all good things. As I said, these are very readily available now and are becoming more so. And again, that 400 million doses by July is fantastic news for for me and for our clients and for I know the physicians and pharmacists and clinicians that are on the phone from all practices here. So I'll pause really quick if anybody wants to take any notes on that, and then we'll kind of progress into a couple of the other topics related to vaccines for children and variants and that sort of thing. Okay, we can go on to the next here. So real quickly, we wanted to touch a little bit on vaccine development for children. So as we just talked about, the Moderna and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines are currently approved for folks that are 18 years and older. The Pfizer vaccine is authorized and used for folks that are 16 and over. The elephant in the room is, well, don't we need to vaccinate children to get them back into school and that sort of thing? And so Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson are all looking into kind of what the efficacy are for these vaccines in children. They're not rolling out clinical trials to the broad extent that they did in the adults. It's only going to be 2,000 to 3,000 adolescents that are being volunteered. But they're basically going to extrapolate some of the results of those clinical trials to say, if it worked for this wellness subpopulation, we're going to take the data that we learned from the adult clinical trials and basically make an assumption in terms of the safety and efficacy of these vaccines for children. So this is to, in my opinion, this is one of the things that's kind of spoken to a little bit less as a result of COVID-19 vaccines, because you hear a lot about the rollout and the vaccine administration and vaccine clinics and that sort of thing across the country, but not a lot of it is actually addressing, are these safe for children? What is being done to ensure they're safe for children? So the takeaway here, I would say, is it's being addressed or it's being researched and reviewed. The clinical trials are happening for all these vaccines in children. So we're well on our way to determine if the vaccine population can dip down below 18 for the couple of vaccines that are out there, as well as below 16 for the Pfizer vaccine. So more to come on that. I have another slide in terms of where we are on those clinical trials, but definitely just wanted to point out the fact that these clinical trials are happening. As you can see, the Pfizer trial is in phase 3. Moderna and Johnson & Johnson are somewhere between phase 2 and phase 3. And what that means in practical terms for us is that we would expect a determination from Pfizer on their efficacy for children sometime probably later this month, if not early May. Moderna, we would expect similar information probably midsummer. And then the Johnson & Johnson one, subject to the current pause that's happening, we would expect sometime in the fall for us to get to a determination of, how eligible members or how young folks can be to get these vaccines. So if you see right in the middle, we talk about eligible ages. Moderna is looking at kind of two subsets, one being 12 to 17, and then one being basically newborns through 11 years old. The other two vaccines are looking at really that 12 to 15, 12 to 17 kind of subpopulation, as those are the ages that are starting to show more and more effects of getting COVID. Obviously, the results in terms of how hard this hits children under the age of 12 in particular, it's, I guess, anecdotally anyways, has said to not be that great. Not that there are not things that happen, but at the same time, they're really looking to target the ages where problems start to manifest for these kids. And so that's why the age groups have been targeted between the 12 and 17 and 12 and 18 subpopulations. So I'll take a breath before we move on. But again, as I said, and we'll have one of the panelists address this as well, but wanted to make sure that everyone knows that, these are approved for adults now, but we're well on our way to getting them approved for children and adolescents, because I think that's incredibly important to make sure that we definitely get beyond this, right? Because if we still have some transmission of this in adolescents, you're going to have a larger, chance, frankly, of getting a susceptible subpopulation of elderly that could be infected. And so the more broadly we can have these vaccines administered, the more quickly we get to the other side of this, and everybody can go to ball games and concerts again, hopefully. At least that's my hope. Okay, flip to the next slide really quick. Great, thank you. So the next thing I wanted to talk on really quickly is related to COVID-19 variants. And this has become bigger and bigger news throughout the last 3, 4, 5 months. I would say probably since January, we've started to see, concern about the Brazilian variant or the UK variant, South African variant. And just a couple of comments on these. And again, I'm not a physician. This is more of what I read and me kind of translating it. But as I understand it, the way that viruses work, these variants were expected, right? I think that, the way that viruses happen, they evolve just like people do, is that they're looking to find a way effectively, right? And so as they hit roadblocks and as people become either vaccinated or become immune via already having an illness, the vaccine will kind of mutate a little bit, or excuse me, the virus will mutate a little bit to try to find a way to be able to infect cells, that sort of thing, to get people sick, right? Because that's what a virus does, is that's what it tries to do. What I will tell you again is that, yes, these were expected, but to put it in a little bit of context, we have many variants of the flu as well, right? And so when you get a flu vaccine every year, the flu vaccine is thought to be somewhere between 40 and maybe 60% effective. The efficacy of these COVID vaccines are in the 90 plus range. And as we have more and more variants that are out, that efficacy will go down, which means people may still get sick, albeit not hospitalized or, not death. And so the best way, as I said, that I can describe it is when we get a flu vaccine, effectively what the flu vaccine is every year is science's smartest people getting together to guess basically which flu variants are going to be dominant in that given year. Sometimes you get it right, sometimes you get it wrong. But again, the variants of the flu that are out there are baked into the flu vaccine every year. And I would expect as we get boosters for the COVID vaccines, they're going to be tested against these variants and they may be tweaked a little bit. And so we'll essentially get a cocktail of those COVID vaccines that are going to potentially address a couple of the variants that are becoming dominant. So again, these were expected. I think as all viruses mutate, this is kind of what we had seen coming. They're testing the current vaccines out there against these variants to figure out levels of efficacy, that sort of thing. The other comment that I will make is this UK variant that's at the top. A little bit outdated in terms of the slide, but it says it's thought to be dominant. It would be the dominant form of COVID by March. I believe that is the case. I know particularly in certain pockets of the United States it is. Where I am in Minnesota, I believe that the UK variant has become 60 to 70%, I think, of all cases that are diagnosed. But again, the folks who are working on vaccine development are testing those Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson vaccines against these variants to ensure that they really are still being effective. And anecdotally, the information that we have is that while they may be somewhat less effective, similar to certain flu shots are less effective to certain strains of the flu, they do ultimately provide that kind of protection that we're looking for the vaccines to provide. So yes, it's a little bit of a curveball. No, it was not unexpected, but again, the vaccines that are being developed are doing a good job of addressing these variants to the extent that they can, and they'll continue to be developed and continue to evolve to make sure that they are providing protection across as much of these variants as possible. Okay, so the next two slides here are talking about the IQVIA plan specifically. And I think the largest takeaway here is that as it relates to COVID, diagnostic testing, treatments, and vaccines are all covered at 100% by the IQVIA plan. Right here, we kind of cover a little bit. Blue Cross and Blue Shield has medically necessary COVID testing covered at 100%, as well as treatment, which means if you do get sick, the therapeutics and that sort of thing that are used to treat patients who have COVID are covered at 100% by the plan. If you want to flip to the next slide, this is specifically related to the vaccines. So actually, as of right now, the COVID vaccines that are out, because they're covered by that emergency use authorization that I mentioned before, are covered at 100% by the government. What the IQVIA plan is covering is the actual administration of that vaccine, meaning every time you go to a CVS and somebody sticks you in the arm, that's going to cost IQVIA $40, basically. The first time, there's some variation in terms of what those admin fees did cost, but the way that the market is trending is that first shot, second shot, or if you get the J&J one shot, if you get stuck in the arm with a needle with a COVID vaccine, it's going to cost IQVIA $40, and they are covering that at 100% on the plan. The one thing I want to mention, which is in bright bold letters here at the bottom, as of about 10 days ago, April 5th, so last Monday, all Florida residents who are 18 and up are COVID vaccine eligible. And I believe this also includes 16 and up for folks who get the Pfizer vaccine. I believe that educators in Florida were eligible for vaccines a number of weeks before this. That include K through 12 as well as higher education. So by and large, the IQVIA members that we're talking to on the phone today, everybody is eligible who wants one. And again, the idea behind the presentation today was to discuss a little bit what's out there, what's available, safety, efficacy, that sort of thing. But again, this underscores, now that you have gotten to the middle of April, everybody in Florida who wants a vaccine should be able to get one without too much trouble, I would say. No, I know there are Facebook groups and that sort of thing that are helping folks track down vaccines, but as I said, and we progress and the production of these vaccines goes up and up and up, it will become easier and easier for folks to get COVID vaccines over the next couple of months. I myself got my first one last week. Everything went well. I didn't have side effects. I know Dr. Diaz and Connie, who are on the phone from Optum, they've also gotten them. They know folks who have gotten all three of the different types of vaccines. And little or no fanfare in terms of what the side effects are. There are some, which I think is expected as well. Maybe a headache, maybe a sore arm. But again, in my opinion, anyways, the benefits of getting vaccinated far outweigh having a sore arm and a headache for a day. And so again, as I mentioned, being residents of Florida, everybody who is on this phone call is going to be eligible to go get a vaccine as soon as they are comfortable getting one. All right. So now we've come to the panel discussion of folks who are much smarter than I am. And so kind of the way that we're going to run this is I have a couple of questions that are sort of canned in terms of, I'm going to ask each of the panelists a question, but we're also going to open it up to the group to ask any questions that you may have. Again, the ask is that we don't lob any personal questions at the physicians or pharmacists on the phone. The thought is that if there's anything that you think would benefit the group in terms of getting it addressed from a broad knowledge base, that's kind of what we're looking to address here. So by way of introduction, I'm just going to buzz through the pictures you see here on the screen. Dr. Korn is the Chief Medical Officer of Blue Cross and Blue Shield. Dr. Alvarez, who some of you may know, is a pharmacist and I think, assistant dean at the NSU Pharmacy School. He is the kind of backbone of the IQVIA Cares program, who many of you probably have worked with related to your prescriptions. Connie Bennett is a pharmacist from OptumRx, who is the PBM or Pharmacy Benefit Manager for IQVIA. Dr. Diaz is one of our Chief Medical Officers at Lockton. And then finally, John Allen Smith is one of our pharmacists and senior directors at Lockton Dunning in the Excelsior Solutions Pharmacy Benefit Practice. So I think that right now we're going to get started. And the first question that I'm going to have is for Dr. Diaz.
Joe.
And that question, yeah, go ahead.
Joe, I would just remind all the panelists to unmute your lines. I do see a few of the panelists are still muted. So just make sure that your lines are unmuted as we proceed through the questions from Joe. And I will also be monitoring the chat box. So if you do have questions for the panelists, please submit them through the chat box as the lines are going to remain muted for the attendees.
Great.
Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Nope, we are good. I appreciate that. And Rachel, once we get to having, after the panelists have answered these first couple of questions, if you want to read the questions off that come through in the chat box, I think that's probably logistically the easiest way to go about doing it.
Perfect.
Okay, so first then, Dr. Diaz, if you want to provide a little bit of background in terms of why the Johnson & Johnson vaccine has been requested to be paused, and talk maybe a little bit about how long it's going to be paused and what to expect as we get through kind of the research that's happening right now. So I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Joe, and good to be with everyone this morning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the J&J and kind of what happened this week. Big news, right? On Tuesday, it was paused by both the FDA and the CDC, and it kind of revolved around a kind of a rare, specific brain blood clotting complication they saw. There were 6 people nearly 7 million doses. So this really was a 1 in a million kind of deal, but it was slightly increased from what we generally see in the population. Usually we see about 5 of these cases per million. And so this was, caught in the eye of some of the regulators. So they're investigating it. So what's interesting is that all of these individuals were women. They were between the ages of 18 and 48. And the incident seemed to happen between days 6 and 13 after receiving the Johnson & Johnson dose. Now, what's important about this is that this complication was not seen with Pfizer or Moderna. And so, that is a really important point. We have, so the pause is expected to last. Maybe the FDA and the CDC suggested it was probably going to be days to weeks, not months or indefinitely. So this definitely is a pause in terms of kind of how they're looking at it. And so, when I was preparing for you guys, I thought, really, does this really make sense from a public health perspective? The answer to that is yes, perfectly. This pause really gives an independent reviewer board, a chance to dig deeper into the data. They verify a lot of the information. Are there other cases that are similar? It allows them to compare. And it also allows, I think probably more importantly, allows the doctors to get familiar with this particular side effect. So there's a couple other points I really wanted to make about it that I thought were important. I think for me anyway, this really does highlight that we have 2 other really safe and effective alternatives, the Pfizer and Moderna, that were not associated with this clotting adverse effect. The data is really good, that people really strongly believe in these vaccines. In fact, about 90% of the people are actually showing up for their second dose. And then we have, I think what Joe alluded to earlier is that we have enough of these vaccines to supply us for every single person in the United States by midsummer. So there's going to be really a lot of supply for these 2 vaccines, and they're amping up in terms of production. The last point I want to make, and I think this is really important, is what does that mean for you and I? So, I think overall what it says to me is that it is, from a regulatory and surveillance perspective, is that it's very transparent, and they're operating this vaccine effort with abundance of caution and a high regard to quality and safety. and Joe alluded to this earlier, my wife actually got the Johnson & Johnson a month ago, and there's no problem. She's happy she did it. She'd go ahead and even after the report, her and I chatted, and she said she's, extremely happy, that she got it. She's, past that 28-day. For me, Joe told you, I actually received my second shot yesterday, and I actually feel great. I was really excited about getting it. So, that's really important. And then, what's coming, I've got two kids, one 13 and one 11, and they'll be getting their vaccinations as soon as they're eligible. My brother and sister, who are both doctors, are fully vaccinated. And I've been talking to a lot of hospital systems, and they've shared with me that approximately about 90% of the doctors that are getting vaccinated. So I really wanted to kind of highlight, the confidence that I've seen and the way I feel about this vaccination effort. As Joe mentioned, the complications and the risks in terms of what COVID can do is been very, very significant. We have 500,000 deaths in the United States just to prove it. So Joe, back to you.
Thanks, Tom. Really appreciate that. Great information and perspective on that. So real quick, the next question that we wanted to flip to Dr. Corin here from Blue Cross Blue Shield. Are COVID-19 vaccines safe for pediatrics and adolescents? I know we had talked a little bit about this in terms of the clinical trials that are happening right now, but Dr. Corin, if you want to convey an opinion or response to that, that would be much appreciated.
Absolutely. Can everyone hear me? I'm sure I'm off mood.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jim Corin. I am the medical director at Blue Cross Blue Shield. I am thrilled to be here today and to see my colleagues. Quite a few of us meet every week on behalf of ICUPA. So we know you guys very well, and it's an opportunity, hopefully, for you guys to get to know us a little bit. I may have had the toughest assignment here because there's lots of uncertainties about COVID-19, and one of the uncertainties remains the disposition of this vaccine for children. Children are very different than adults. Anyone who's a parent knows that darn well, and they have a very different immune system. So one of the most interesting and one of the few things that we know with certainty with COVID-19 is that children seem to be subject to the multiple, I forget what the word is, but it's a MIS-C condition, the multi-system inflammatory condition that occurs after COVID-19. It's felt to be immunologically mediated, and it doesn't seem to happen in adults. And I say that not to scare anybody, but rather to say, look, kids do react differently to the virus. So could they or might they react differently to the vaccine? And the answer today, including with the late stage release of some Pfizer data for kids who are 12 to 16, is that kids react very, very favorably and very, very safely to the two-dose vaccines. Why do I stress the two-dose vaccines? Because those are the ones that have currently been studied. As everyone has heard and it reads in the papers, the J&J vaccine was a little behind that in the pivotal trials to begin with. And now we know that if there's going to be a reaction to the J&J vaccine, or for that matter, the AstraZeneca one that uses the same technology in Europe, it's probably going to occur in women. It may occur in girls, we don't know, but it's definitely going to occur in younger folks versus older folks. So I think that certainly, although the immediate urgency is to investigate the J&J vaccine and investigate its utility because it doesn't require storage for and ultra low temperatures. It's much more transportable, and of course it only requires one vaccine. Quite appropriately, the urgency is determined whether it's safe in adults and not kids. So the data that has been published by Pfizer shows that they did a relatively small series, and I'm gonna put an asterisk there. It was only about 2,000 to 3,000 adolescents between 12 and 16, and it showed that 100% of the kids who got the COVID vaccine versus the placebo did not contract COVID. There were 18 cases of COVID in the 1,000+ kids that got the placebo. So it was completely protective. So what does that tell us? Joe mentioned that it's going to be smaller trials in kids, but there's still, when you read the pediatric literature, first of all, a great deal of enthusiasm about this. The American Academy of Pediatrics is strongly vaccine focused and strongly of the opinion that once the appropriate safety studies are released, that they are going to be recommending vaccination. The most vaccinated nation in the world is Israel. There's a great deal about the Israeli experience that I find very interesting, particularly what you need to do to get to herd immunity, which probably means vaccinating more than half the folks. Israel made a decision locally to vaccinate high-risk kids, kids with cystic fibrosis, leukemia, really horrible diseases, with their 2-dose vaccine. And again, they elicited absolutely no complications, 0. So here's the odds. We know that there's about 300 children who have died of coronavirus in this country. We know that there have been many, as many as thousands who've had this multi-system inflammatory disease. And we know that there's not a single child out there who's had serious or life-threatening complications from any of the 2-dose vaccines. That's a pretty good story. Now, here's what the naysayers would say, and I'm not one of them, nor is the American Academy of Pediatrics. They would say, well, have we investigated every type of kid? To be blunt, a lot of the kids in the trials were folks like Dr. Diaz's kids, children of physicians and investigators and academics and things like that. Have we employed sufficient diversity in the clinical trials? Have we vaccinated African Americans, folks of different types of Hispanic ancestry, people of Asian ancestry, and so forth? That's definitely something that will be in the hands of the FDA if and when they look to extend the emergency authorization to the age of 12 initially. I should add that Moderna and Pfizer are looking at much younger patients. Moderna, I think it's down to 6 months. And Pfizer is extending it, I believe, to 2 years. But the most recent data that I mentioned from kids between 12 and 16 and the Israeli experience is already out there. So here's the executive summary. We don't know. We do know that there's substantial risk to children, or there's a quantifiable, let's not say substantial, risk to children from the complications of COVID-19. We know that there is an ill-defined but perhaps greater risk to their teachers and their grandparents, as well as to herd immunity. So there's a tremendous public health need. We know that there's a great deal of safety data out there. And most importantly, we know that the American Academy of Pediatrics is a strong proponent. So I've gotten pinged constantly by folks at Blue Cross and my employer community saying, what do you think about kids? And of course, I'm going to say, ask your doctor. But I've also been very forthright that I'm very positive about it. I think that we all need to pay attention to the single versus the 2-dose vaccines. But just to conclude my part, there's not a single kid on the planet who's received the vaccine who's been known to have any serious or life-threatening complications. And
Thanks, Dr. Corin. Joe, we do have a question in the chat box. Are there expected any more single-dose vaccines to come out? And if so, do you know the timeline? Maybe one of the pharmacists can answer that one.
We don't know. I think that the obviously the hope of all the vaccine manufacturers is to bring it down to 1 dose, but I think that still has a way, quite a while to go before being able to determine if 1 dose is sufficient. As a matter of fact, Pfizer is now looking at potentially a 3rd dose of a booster shot 12 months after. So just from a compliance or an adherence perspective, that would be the way for most manufacturers to try to do, but it's not as easy as all that, I suppose.
Thanks, Dr. Alvarez. And the other point I'll make too, kind of piggyback on that, is the Johnson & Johnson shot is the only one that has one vaccine or one dose. The AstraZeneca one, which I believe is works in a similar fashion as the Johnson & Johnson, is actually a 2-dose vaccine as well. So everything except for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that we've seen that's in production is a 2-dose regimen. And to Dr. Alvarez's point, potentially looking at annual boosters or booster shots 9 to 12 months after original vaccination for each of those shots that are on the market right now. So Dr. Korn, thank you very much for that. You are absolutely correct. We threw you the curveball of the questions, but you handled it eloquently. So we appreciate the context and the input. So Dr. Diaz, one more quick question for you. Can you comment a little bit on, do the vaccines prevent transmission, or they just limit kind of symptoms of getting COVID? Can you provide a little bit of context on that?
So I'm going to start off with the executive summary. So the executive summary is about transmission. It's being studied. We really don't have a definitive answer, but there are some suggestions and some things that we do know. I like to divide it into 2 questions. The first is, will it protect me, right? And so we know that the Pfizer Moderna is highly effective. It's 95% effective in preventing COVID and appears slightly less effective against the South African variant. So, we have to put it in the context of kind of where we are and kind of where we're going. We're going to be having more and more variants. So, in terms of how they play against the variants, as you mentioned, Joe, on that slide, the super spreader variant or that UK variant, the one that is like really fit to spread, that one, the Pfizer Moderna is very, very effective. So, that is really, really important. These studies that are going on in terms of transmission, in terms of will they prevent me from passing it on to other people, they suggest that they are very, very effective, but these are going to take about 2 years, in terms of, looking at not only how, how they're transmitting and how effective they are, but also how long this immunity lasts. That's another question that really is kind of being popping into this whole idea about, what happens after I get the vaccination. We're also kind of looking at special populations. How do they work in terms of these questions, transmissibility? How do they work in terms of immunity in older individuals, and as Dr. Korn was mentioning, in the children and the children less than 12. This is really important because everyone, we kind of need a blanket of over, in terms of preventing, the spread, right? When people ask me about COVID, I kind of think of it as a tornado. You're kind of sitting there and you don't know if you're going to be one of the ones that's going to be mild or asymptomatic, or if you're going to be one of the ones that ends up, in a hospital. So, my brother and I have talked about this over the past year quite a bit. He's a doctor. He's practicing. I like to call it, he's the real doctor. I was in practice for about 20 years, but now I do a lot of work with data, right? But he kind of mentioned something to me a few months ago that in this tornado analogy, I guess, you can have one house that's just demolished, and the families are just devastated with COVID, and then you got the house sitting right next to them that nothing really happened. And that's kind of what we're seeing with COVID. He was talking about, this 25-year-old that he was taking care of in the ICU. He was really, really sick. He had, obviously some of the more, really, real complications of COVID. And then he had, 80-year-olds that had, very mild symptoms. And that's kind of the mystery of COVID. So this this whole idea about getting vaccinated and, how do I feel today? Well, I got a little soreness in my arm, but I literally feel great. So, I think that's kind of, the picture you gotta think about in terms of what Dr. Korn was saying and what the way we feel about it. So, there's still more questions and there's still more things that we're trying to understand. I think the last point I'm going to make is, about 40% of people that are spreading COVID don't have any symptoms. And so it's that asymptomatic. And a lot of the studies from both Pfizer and from Moderna seem to indicate they're very, very effective at even transmitting that piece of it. And so that I think that's really important, because even the CDC says, if everyone's been vaccinated, by July 4th, we can hopefully, kind of see our families again in terms of that. So, I will, kind of lift the blanket a little bit, if you will, by saying masks are still really important. There is no vaccine that's 100%. And so when you have, even 5%, or even, reinfections do occur. And so masks are still going to play a really important role in this whole pandemic. I like to think of the masks as the brakes in a car. And I like to think of the vaccines as almost like the parking brake. So that's the big one. So we actually need both, kind of, in terms of as we move forward in this pandemic. Joe, back to you.
Thanks, Tom. That was great. I appreciate it. So next, I'm going to bring it back to John Allen Smith, who's one of the pharmacists on the locked-in side here. Two-part question for you. The first being, how long does immunity last, if we know? And the second thing is any vaccine better or safer than any of the others?
All right. Thanks, Joe, and glad to be with you all today. I think we've touched on a little bit how long does the immunity last, and are booster shots going to be necessary? Dr. Alvarez mentioned that, Pfizer is in the process of looking at a third booster shot. The Pfizer CEO just yesterday afternoon mentioned that they're looking at the likelihood of a third booster to maintain the immunity from the vaccine. The short answer here is we don't know yet. There's no way to know for sure until time passes. So we can keep studying and figuring out how long do people maintain immunity from the vaccines once they've been fully inoculated on the first round. So we don't know for sure yet, but it does certainly look like there will be booster shots, or at least right now looking like a booster shot for Pfizer. Could be in that 9 to 12 month range. So, does that just kind of fall to an annual booster shot, kind of like the annual flu shot? I think there could be a lot of discussion around getting, at some point, getting your flu shot and your COVID vaccine at the same time, and doing that on an annual basis. And so I think my prediction is that there will likely be booster shots. There very well could be annual. They could be every 2 years. They could be every 5 years. We're not sure yet. And it could depend on the vaccine and the nuances of it. But at least I'm planning, I've been fully vaccinated as well. And I'm planning on getting a booster shot most likely in the next 12 months. But I'm waiting to see how everything plays out on the data as time passes and we see what happens to our bodies. So that's the short one on how long does immunity last. We don't know for sure, but it's likely we'll get some boosters. As far as is any vaccine better or safer than the others, Dr. Diaz and others have kind of mentioned about some of the coverage of the vaccines between the different variants and also the effectiveness. I'll tell you, my personal opinion is that I would get any vaccine that you can get access to. I certainly did. I wasn't picking and choosing. When I got my appointment and was able to get one, I took whatever of the 3 vaccines that were available at the time they could give. I happened to get the Pfizer vaccine and got my second shot. My wife is also a pharmacist, and my parents are both pharmacists. They all happened to get the Moderna vaccine. And I've got a brother who's a pharmacist who happened to get the J&J vaccine. And none of us were selective. We were all, any of the 3 are great vaccines. I know we've got the J&J on pause right now. And I think that only highlights how serious the scientists are taking the safety of these vaccines, with 6 out of 7 million being just such a very, very small number. To put the vaccines, that vaccine on pause for that number is not an indication of how serious that is, in my opinion. It's an indication of how serious that everyone is taking the safety of these, and that if there's something we don't know, that we're going to find out before we continue. So, so from my perspective, all of the vaccines are phenomenal vaccines. It's been a fun thing to see the technology of the two, Moderna and Pfizer, with the mRNA that they have. There's some advantages to that, I think, as they may be more agile in terms of when variants are discovered, their ability to adjust those in future booster shots or in future series to cover those variants relatively quickly. So that's kind of a cool advantage they have. Of course, J&J, if that gets unpaused, you got the huge advantage of getting a one and done. And that's pretty awesome. So, so I think that'd be my take on that. I'd certainly be open to the rest of the panelists' thoughts on that, but all of them are good, and I would take personally any of the three vaccines if they were to unpause J&J for me and my family that was available.
Thanks, John Allen. So I've learned that your entire family is pharmacists and Dr. Diaz's entire family is doctors. So that's a data point for myself as well. All right.
Joe, we do have one
quick
question in the chat. We have one question in the chat box. If someone receives the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, if it's ever time for a booster, can they receive the booster from Pfizer or Moderna, or do they need to stay within the same brand?
So Joe, I'll go ahead and take that one. You know, the Johnson & Johnson is only a one dose. So, you know, if you've already had that, you're good. You know, you're fully vaccinated after that, especially that 28-day mark. And so, you know, the second part of that question is if you've received either the Johnson & Johnson, either the Pfizer or Moderna, it's recommended, especially now with the abundance of how many of these vaccines, you kind of stay within that same family. That's how the studies were done. You know, I think there's pockets of you know, really kind of, you know, really exceptions to that. But, you know, we try to stay as close as we can to the trial. So, you know, in terms of that, so if you've gotten the Johnson, if you've gotten the Pfizer, if you've gotten Moderna, it's best to say, you know, with that the same dose.
Thanks, Tom. And to emphasize the point that you just made, that's not to say that if you switched versions or brands of it, it wouldn't work. At the same time, the clinical trials that were run kept everything within essentially the same family. And so that's what the physician recommendations are, to adhere to the way that the trials were actually run, because that's what we know the results of.
You know, in doctor speak, we really like, you know, those, you know, trials. You know, we're really all about the clinical trials. So anything that's outside of those clinical trials, we kind of, you know, well, it's not as good as a clinical trial. So Joe, you're exactly right. You know, if the trials say this, we really want to kind of stick to what, you know, kind of that direction first.
Sure. Great. Thanks, Tom. All right, Ms. Connie Bennett, we have one question for you. Can you provide a little bit of an opinion on what the long-term effects of the vaccines may be, if we know?
Well, sure, Joe. The reality here is that these vaccines just haven't been studied long enough to know how they're going to affect us in the long term. But to date, there's nothing in the technology that would lead us to believe that there's a risk of any long-term side effects. And the only way to really know this is that we continue to follow the participants in the trial, vaccinate and study more people, and then follow all of these people for several years. And that's what's in place now. You know, we keep looking at the data and studying it. I have had the Moderna vaccine very early. I'm about 3 months out of my second dose now, and I didn't have any problems. But one of the things that was offered to me, and I would encourage anyone to participate in this, was the little CDC app for your phone. It was called vSafe. And what that app did was it collected data. CDC was collecting data. For the first week or two, it asked me every day for certain side effects. And even 3 months out now, it went from daily to weekly and then monthly. And I guess depending on how you answered any of those questions, then they would have follow-up surveys for you. It's on your phone, it doesn't even take 15 seconds. So I would encourage everyone to participate in that app, because that's how we're going to collect data, and that's how we're going to learn about what is to come from these vaccines.
Thanks, Connie. I appreciate that. And to underscore that point, the first vaccines were administered to folks in December of 2020, so they're only about 5 months out. And so it would be great if we had a crystal ball, but the anecdotal evidence and the evidence that the CDC is gathering, as Connie mentioned, is what is going to lead us down the path of being able to project whether or not there are long-term effects. So thank you, Connie. I appreciate that. All right. So the last question we have for the panelists prior to opening it up again to anybody else on the phone. Dr. Alvarez, will the vaccines prevent serious illness, hospitalizations, and death? Can you talk a little bit about what the quote efficacy means related to kind of the clinical studies for each of the vaccines?
So sure. So in terms of efficacy, there is a breakdown in regard to the efficacy, and most of the literature primarily talks about the efficacy in regards to severe disease. So all of the vaccines are extremely efficacious against, basically an individual ending up in the hospital or having severe symptoms from COVID. Some of the other vaccines, actually the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, are also very effective in even mild to moderate symptoms. Johnson & Johnson is a little bit less in terms of those mild to moderate. But again, all of the vaccines are extremely safe, and safe meaning as far as we know at the moment, and very efficacious in terms of preventing deaths and preventing hospitalizations. Just like Dr. Smith, my family is also a group of pharmacists. So my brother's a pharmacist, my father was a pharmacist. We tried to convince my sister to be a pharmacist, but she went a different path. But other than that, and again, we've, so my brother's been vaccinated. We also did not ask, which vaccine are we getting? We asked when we were there, but it wouldn't have made any difference. We all basically gave our arm and accepted whatever vaccine we were given. I was given the Moderna. My wife was given the Pfizer vaccine. My daughter received the Moderna as well. And so that's the bottom line. The risks of the actual virus, the COVID virus, the coronavirus, and the consequences of getting the disease itself are far outweighed by whatever possible concerns we might have regarding the vaccine itself.
Thank you, Dr. Alvarez. I appreciate that. So before we get to any questions that have come through the chat box, I first and foremost wanted to thank all the panelists today for participation in this. Obviously, the information and the transparency provided, I think, helps incredibly with respect to safety and efficacy, or any kind of hesitation in the ACUBA group that may be out there. Each of you provides an independent and interesting perspective based on your experiences from you yourself being vaccinated, but as well as your clinical and professional expertise. So again, I just want to thank everybody for the time and your thoughtful responses to each of these questions. So with that, Rachel, I'll turn it to you. Are there any more questions that have come in through the chat box?
Only one, to reiterate the name of the app to track the symptoms from the vaccine. Just came in.
Okay.
I think you guys mentioned an app.
Yes, it's called VSafe. I think you can get the app when you're getting the injection. I was given a little piece of paper and it had a barcode on it. You scanned it and you immediately downloaded it. But I believe you can find it in the App Store for either the iPhone or the other smartphones, any smartphone. But I believe there's a link in the cdc.gov for the app.
Yeah.
And I just actually copied that link from the CDC into the chat for you guys.
Great.
Thank you.
And
Rachel, can we?
I was just going to mention, if anyone on the call is interested in any kind of mass distribution effort, maybe one of the colleges or universities or even the schools want to put on some sort of vaccination clinic. I know that Optum actually has a database of volunteers, and most state boards of pharmacy or pharmacy associations have collected a database where you can get volunteers to come and work at these mass distribution clinics.
Connie, I'd be interested in speaking with you. We just started a COVID vaccine clinic at NSU about 4 weeks ago. We've
Okay.
immunized about 5,000 individuals so far. And Joe, you haven't gotten a bill yet, right? We haven't billed anyone, so
believe so.
basically we haven't billed and don't plan to. So we are. It's manned primarily by volunteers, but we're doing about between 300 and 400 immunizations per day. We've been doing that sustainably for about 4 weeks now. And now we were actually doing the Janssen vaccine. And since the pause, we are now going to be doing the Pfizer vaccine starting Monday.
Sure, I'll find out the name of the contact for Optum that keeps this database, and I'll send that to you. And I'm sure there are people in Florida that have signed up.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Thank you, guys. And if anybody's in the Fort Lauderdale area, go find Dr. Alvarez and he'll stick a needle in your arm.
There you go.
All right. So Rachel, we are right just about at the top of the hour here. Any other questions that have come in that we would like the panel to address today?
Nope, no other questions. Thank you, guys. If there's any other last minute questions, please submit them now through the chat box. But we are at the top of the hour, so I really appreciate the information that was shared.
Thank you again, everybody. Very happy to be here and to do this for the group today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.